Few of the blunders of World War II were as great as Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The attack brought the United States into the war. It lasted just under 2 hours, though most of the damage was inflicted in the first 30 minutes. When it was over, more than 2,300 military and civilian personnel were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded. When news of the attack reached the mainland, people were initially stunned. But as the enormity of what happened sank in, there was a great general outcry for revenge. America mobilized for war. 4.5 years later, atom bombs exploded over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with appalling consequences. Japan was forced to surrender on August 14, 1945. The people of Japan ultimately paid a terrible price for the ambitions and complacency of their military leaders. Many traced the blame back to the fateful attack on Pearl Harbor. By bringing the United States into the war, Japan ensured its own total and humiliating defeat. But the Japanese blunder in attacking Pearl Harbor was compounded by mistakes in the planning and conduct of the attack. By December 1941, the war in Europe had been raging for 2 years. Under the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, the United States was giving the Allies the munitions and raw materials they needed, but the U.S. refused to intervene militarily. After the horrors of World War I, Americans were reluctant to be pulled into another global conflict. Meanwhile, Japan had become a major power. During the 1930s, it had extended its influence throughout the Far East, seizing much of northern and central China and dominating large parts of Southeast Asia. Japan wanted to expand its territory for 2 reasons. First, Japan had experienced a population explosion. Second, Japan was extremely short of raw materials, especially oil, which was necessary to support their industrial growth. Matters grew worse during a world economic slump at the end of the 1920s, which hit Japan particularly hard. In 1931, Japan forcibly annexed Manchuria. Six years later, Japan invaded China. As a result, the U.S. began to give financial aid to China with the support and encouragement of Great Britain. This did not deter Japanese aggression. Japan retaliated by attacking American and British ships. It even sank the gunboat USS Panay in Chinese waters off Shanghai. President Roosevelt was appalled and wanted to mount an immediate naval blockade against Japan. He backed off when Britain failed to support him. Japan was so dependent on U.S. oil imports that it eventually apologized for attacking the Panay. Without oil from abroad, Japan's military ambitions would have soon ground to a halt. In mid-1941, the country only had enough oil for the next 18 months. Admiral Nagano, chief of Japan's naval staff, realized his country's critical situation. He told Emperor Hirohito that Japan was like a fish in a pond that was gradually being drained. Japan needed to become self-sufficient in raw materials. To do so, it needed an overseas empire. The Japanese High Command drew up an ambitious war plan. It included capturing Thailand, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. In the meantime, Japanese aggression against China continued, despite protests from the U.S. and Great Britain. Eventually, President Roosevelt felt he had no choice but to freeze Japan's assets in the United States, and more importantly, to cut off its oil supply. Admiral Nomura, Japan's ambassador to Washington, warned his government that the United States was serious and that Japan should make concessions, but the Japanese leadership was about to commit a grave error. Japanese Prime Minister Prince Konoye was worried by President Roosevelt's decision to freeze Japan's assets in the U.S. He argued that Japan should be prepared to make concessions over China. Members of his cabinet opposed him. On October 17, 1941, he was replaced by the aggressive war minister, General Hideki Tojo. Tojo was determined to build Japan's new empire, but he was fully aware that the powerful U.S. Pacific Fleet was a major obstacle. Japan's military leaders and strategists had been plotting a strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet as early as December 1940. The chief architect of the final plan was Admiral Ishiroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto believed in the power of the aircraft carrier. In particular, he was inspired by the successful British carrier attack on the Italian fleet base at Taranto, which sank 3 battleships. He developed a similar attack plan on the main U.S. Pacific Fleet base in the Hawaiian Islands, Pearl Harbor. But Yamamoto recognized that America was a dangerous enemy. He had spent time in the U.S. during the 1920s and knew that its industrial base would give America a powerful edge in war. Still, he thought it would take the U.S. at least 6 months to rebuild its Pacific Fleet. By that time, Yamamoto hoped Japan would have consolidated its overseas empire. The United States, he thought, would then find the cost of driving Japan back too high. After heated discussion, the Japanese High Command allowed Yamamoto to proceed. On November 26, 1941, the United States told Japan to withdraw her troops from China. There was no response. This was hardly surprising. The Japanese fleet, maintaining complete radio silence, had set sail for Hawaii 4 days earlier. The fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. It consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and some 430 attack aircraft. In addition, 27 Japanese submarines were deployed near the entrance of Pearl Harbor itself. 5 of these carried midget submarines. U.S. intelligence had assumed for some time that an attack was imminent. In fact, U.S. codebreakers had been deciphering top-secret messages to the Japanese embassy in Washington for several months. The U.S. knew Japan was ready to strike somewhere in the Pacific. But where? Early warnings had been sent to various outlying military commands, including Hawaii, where approximately 100 vessels, just under half the U.S. Pacific Fleet, were at anchor in the harbor. But by a stroke of luck, all three of the fleet's aircraft carriers were at sea, carrying Marine fighter planes to U.S. Pacific outposts. Nagumo's fleet reached its attack point on the evening of December 6, 1941, 275 miles north of Hawaii. The Japanese had a very clear idea of the layout of Pearl Harbor. The primary targets of the attack would be the airfields, the battleships, and the aircraft carriers, whose absence Japanese intelligence failed to detect. The attack would take place in two waves. The first had 180 aircraft, and the second, a short time later, had around 160. The remaining Japanese planes were to be held in reserve. At 6:15 on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off, led by Commander Mitsuo Fushida. The first planes appeared over Pearl Harbor just before 8 a.m. Japan was about to follow a path from which there was no turning back. As Sunday, December 7th, 1941 dawned at Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack from the air was the last thing on anyone's mind. A U.S. radar operator picked up the incoming Japanese aircraft, but was told it was probably a group of American B-17s on their way to the base. The Japanese planes approached the fleet base from the north. Then the attack began. Within 30 minutes, the airfields were reduced to a tangled heap of smoldering wreckage. Worse, the gleaming pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Battleship Row, was nothing but burning hulks. The Japanese attack was such a surprise that the U.S. failed to engage the Japanese planes. The second attack began at 8:40 a.m. By this time, the U.S. had recovered from the initial shock and fought back. But it was inadequate. The base suffered more damage and loss of life. Japanese airmen who had taken off less than 4 hours before were convinced they had achieved a knockout blow. It would take them months to realize they had, in fact, committed a terrible blunder. Back at Pearl Harbor, the devastation was total. "180 American aircraft had been destroyed. base was virtually defenseless against further air attack. But even worse was the damage to the Pacific Fleet. Five battleships were totally destroyed, and the other 3 badly damaged. Altogether, 2,300 people died, including more than 1,100 on the battleship Arizona. The Japanese lost only 5 of their midget submarines, around 30 aircraft and about 100 men. The Japanese High Command considered it a small price to pay for disabling the entire battleship force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. When news of the attack reached the U.S., the public was stunned. President Roosevelt addressed Congress.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
U.S. neutrality was swept aside. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. and Britain declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The conflict had now become global. At last, Britain, standing alone, had an ally capable of defeating Nazi Germany. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only led to the defeat of Tokyo's European allies, it also had dire consequences for Japan itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the greatest blunders in the history of warfare. Anger over Japan's attack united the American public as never before. One member of the Japanese High Command remarked, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." Yamamoto and his planners also committed serious tactical blunders. They failed to target Pearl Harbor's oil storage tanks. The loss of oil would have prevented the U.S. Pacific Fleet from going to sea for months. That would have given Japan a freer hand in the Pacific. Worse, in their belief that they had dealt the U.S. a grievous blow, the Japanese totally ignored the fact that the U.S. carriers were still at large. These ships would soon become the backbone of the new Pacific Fleet. As America mobilized for war, Japan's belief that the U.S. would allow them to consolidate their empire proved a fatal miscalculation. Japan continued to overrun such countries as the Philippines, Burma, and Malaya. For a while, Japan seemed unstoppable. Then, the U.S. carriers and escorts that survived Pearl Harbor were sent to the Southwest Pacific. On May 9, 1942, they clashed in the Coral Sea. A Japanese invasion force was en route to Papua New Guinea. After a fierce battle, the Japanese withdrew. They were thwarted for the first time. Undeterred, the Japanese turned east a month later. The target was the Pacific outpost of Midway. Japan first launched an airstrike against the island itself. But the U.S. carriers then struck back. They sank the 4 Japanese carriers present. It was a devastating setback. Yamamoto was shocked by this reversal of his country's fortunes and ordered the combined fleet to retreat immediately. He and the Japanese High Command finally began to realize how wrong they'd been about the American determination to fight. After Midway, the U.S. began island hopping in the Pacific. This brought U.S. forces ever closer to the Japanese mainland. In spite of mounting losses, Japan fought on for 3 more bloody years. During the last year of the conflict, U.S. heavy bombers brought the horrors of war to Japan itself. This culminated in the dropping of atom bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Faced with this awesome and destructive power, Japan had no choice but to surrender. Japan's military leaders had deluded themselves about their attack on Pearl Harbor, and thereby committed an ultimately fatal blunder. During World War II, the war in the Pacific would last for nearly 4 years. It stretched from the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific down to the coast of Australia, and from the west coast of the United States to the shores of China. The Pacific campaign was dominated by amphibious landings on tropical islands and bitter fighting on shore. Naval supremacy over the surrounding seas was necessary for Allied operations to succeed. The critical naval battle that gave the U.S. Navy dominance over the vast expanse of the Pacific and the skies above it was waged just 6 months into the war against Japan. The Battle of Midway was fought in early June 1942. The U.S. won, forcing the Japanese onto the defensive. This was largely a result of Japanese blunders in planning, lack of reconnaissance, and the mishandling of carrier aircraft. After the Japanese surprise attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they swept rapidly across the Central and Southwest Pacific. The objective was to create the greater Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere. The intent behind this objective was to make Japan self-sufficient in raw materials, many of which could not be obtained on the Japanese mainland. Malaya and Singapore were quickly overrun, providing Japan with rubber, tin, and other essentials. Soon after, the Japanese landed in the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, and the northern Solomon Islands. They also thrust eastward across the Pacific, capturing Wake Island and other American island outposts. But while the Japanese never intended to invade America, they did want to weaken U.S. military strength, which threatened their newly secured empire. With this in mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, conceived a grandiose plan in March 1942. His aim was to destroy the rest of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The objective was America's most western island outpost in the Pacific, Midway. Situated 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, Midway was considered an observation and early warning location. The Japanese called it Pearl Harbor's Sentry. It was so important to the Americans that Yamamoto believed a Japanese attack on it would attract the bulk of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and give him the chance to destroy it. The Hawaiian Islands would then be open to Japanese capture. To ensure a victory, Yamamoto intended to deploy almost the entire Japanese Navy so as to give him massive naval superiority. This upheld the military principle of concentration of force. But almost as soon as Yamamoto drew up his plan, the Japanese High Command changed it. These changes dramatically reduced the naval strength of Operation Mai, as the Midway operation was codenamed. The Japanese High Command then added 2 more operations to Midway. First, they enlarged Operation Mai by planning the simultaneous seizure of the westernmost Aleutian Islands in the northern Pacific. They argued that this would draw a significant part of the U.S. fleet away from Midway. But there was no guarantee of this, and it would leave fewer Japanese warships for the Midway battle. The second edition was an operation in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese had already secured the Dutch East Indies and the Northern Solomon Islands. Now they wanted to threaten Australia, but needed to secure Papua New Guinea to do that. Landings had already been made on the northern coast, but Japan needed to quickly seize Port Moresby, the Papuan capital, on the southwest coast. The Japanese army wanted to attack Port Moresby from the sea. To ensure the necessary air support, they needed aircraft carriers. Yamamoto agreed to loan 3 of his precious carriers for this operation. He mistakenly believed the Americans had lost their will to fight and thought it was worth the risk of not having them available for Midway. This ill-timed assault and the diversion of forces to the Aleutians reduced Japan's chances of victory over the U.S. Japan now put its restructured plan for Midway Island into action. In April 1942, a Japanese task force for an assault on Port Moresby assembled in the northern Solomon Islands. But the United States already knew about the Japanese plan for New Guinea. A secret weapon, codenamed Magic, made it possible for the U.S. to read Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sent a task force built around the carriers Lexington and Yorktown to the Southwest Pacific. On May 4, 1942, this task force intercepted the Japanese Port Moresby invasion force in the Coral Sea between Papua and the Solomons. American carrier aircraft successfully attacked the Japanese. One of the 3 Japanese carriers was sunk, another severely damaged. The third lost most of its aircraft. The failure of Japan's Port Moresby operation condemned the Japanese to a long, arduous, and ultimately fruitless campaign in the jungles of New Guinea. But more importantly, it took 3 carriers away from the Midway attack. Their absence significantly affected the Midway operation. The Japanese High Command was undeterred by its setback in the Coral Sea. The Midway operation was scheduled for the beginning of June, only a month after the action in the Coral Sea. The final Japanese plan for Operation Mai was more complicated than Yamamoto had originally envisioned. The Midway force was split into 4 parts. First, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike force would conduct preparatory air attacks against Midway. It used 4 carriers, less than originally planned, because of America's success in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Then came the main group of powerful battleships directed by Yamamoto himself. Admiral Raizo Tanaka commanded the Midway invasion force. Support was provided by Admiral Nabutake Kondo, 2 battleships, a light carrier, cruisers, and destroyers. Nagumo and Yamamoto were to set sail from Japan's inland sea. Kondo and Tanaka would depart from the Marianas. But the first blow was a diversion delivered by Admiral Mishiro Hosogaya. It was a second carrier force which would sail from northern Japan. His plan was to launch an air attack against Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians in the hope that this would lure American carriers to the north and away from Midway. This reflected the changes the Japanese High Command made to Yamamoto's original plan. Once the Aleutians diversion was underway, Nagumo would launch an airstrike against Midway to destroy U.S. air power on the ground. The Japanese landings could then proceed, along with those in the westernmost Aleutians. Nagumo, Yamamoto, and Kondo would then destroy the main body of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and deal with the American carriers later. The degree of coordination required was more complex than Yamamoto's original plan. This worried some Japanese subordinate commanders. They pleaded for a postponement to allow more time for preparation. The Japanese High Command refused to listen. Operation Mai would go on as scheduled. Now it was Yamamoto's turn to blunder. The U.S. carrier Lexington was sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but the Japanese were convinced they had also sunk the Yorktown. In fact, the Yorktown had returned to Pearl Harbor and was being repaired. The U.S. Pacific Fleet also had 2 other operational carriers. In April 1942, under Admiral Bull Halsey, the Enterprise and the Hornet took part in the audacious bombing raid on mainland Japan by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and his B-25 Mitchells. After the attacks, the B-25s flew on to China. The 2 aircraft carriers had returned to Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese assumed they were still there on the eve of the Midway attack. Yamamoto made no attempt to confirm this, which he could have done by air reconnaissance. A submarine screen off Hawaii would have been just as effective, but this was not deployed until just before the attack on Midway. The Japanese had blundered in the planning and preparation of the Midway operation. They had severely weakened their forces with the diversions in the Southwest Pacific and the Aleutians. Their revised plan was just too complicated, and they failed to confirm the location of the U.S. carriers. All this gave the Americans a critical advantage. Once again, the code-breaking technology known as magic forewarned the U.S. about an imminent Japanese attack. The codebreakers were able to identify Midway as the primary Japanese objective. The U.S. Pacific Fleet prepared for the attack. On May 27, 1942, the Japanese combined fleet set sail. On the following day, Admiral Nimitz ordered the carriers Enterprise and Hornet to head for Midway. Repairs on the Yorktown were accelerated so she could join the other two carriers at sea. Nimitz intended to ignore Japan's diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in the far north. PBY Catalina maritime patrols from Midway were intensified. The Americans knew the Japanese were on their way. On June 3rd, as the Japanese assault on the Aleutians was beginning, one of the Catalinas spotted the Japanese fleet steaming towards Midway. B-17 bombers took off from the island to attack, but were unsuccessful. At the same time, the three U.S. carriers met 350 miles northeast of Midway. Now, all the chess pieces were in place. It was Admiral Nagumo's move. Early on June 4th, he launched his airstrike against Midway. It caused considerable damage. But the runways were still serviceable, and many U.S. aircraft escaped destruction. Nagumo was unaware that the American carriers were in the area. He began organizing a second strike. At this point, U.S. torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers. Almost all the bombers were shot down by Zero fighters, but they were able to force the Japanese carriers to take evasive action. Nagumo now ordered his aircraft preparing for the second Midway strike to get rid of their bombs so they could deal with further American airstrikes. But it was already too late. U.S. dive bombers now attacked. They sank 3 out of Nagumo's 4 carriers. The Zeros, drawn to a lower altitude by torpedo bombers, were unable to cope with this new attack. The surviving Japanese carrier then attacked the U.S. carrier Yorktown. The Yorktown was hit and seriously damaged. U.S. dive bombers retaliated by damaging the Japanese carrier. Both sides now withdrew. Yamamoto was still determined to engage the U.S. fleet. He ordered Nagumo to reverse course and prepare for night action. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the American carrier commander, knew that by destroying the most important part of the Japanese fleet, the carriers, he had decisively beaten them. He saw no reason to renew the fight. Yamamoto therefore ordered the cancellation of the Midway operation. The Japanese withdrew. In a departing stroke, U.S. aircraft sank 2 Japanese cruisers, which had previously collided. A Japanese submarine finished off the Yorktown. Although the Japanese had successfully landed in the westernmost Aleutians, their garrisons were quickly isolated by U.S. troops. Operation Mai proved a complete disaster. The final Japanese plan was overly ambitious and complicated. The High Command's insistence on the Aleutians' diversion dissipated their forces, as had Yamamoto's allocation of carriers to the Port Moresby operation. Yamamoto had further blundered by not confirming the whereabouts of the 3 U.S. carriers. Those ships later proved to be decisive weapons against the Japanese. The United States victory at Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese turned from offense to defense as the Allies pushed them back across the ocean toward mainland Japan. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Operation Mai, would eventually fall victim to that priceless American weapon, magic. In the spring of 1943, U.S. codebreakers learned Yamamoto was planning an inspection tour of air bases in the northern Solomons. On April 18, 1943, his aircraft was shot down by P-38s over the jungles of Bougainville. The wreckage of his aircraft is there to this day. It is ironic that Yamamoto, who twice tried to destroy U.S. forces in the Pacific, eventually fell victim to them.